Alright, so we are back here with another video about the Cold War. So the idea is fighting communism in America. So the previous video primarily focused on how do we combat communism abroad with the Truman Doctrine, with the Marshall Plan, containment is kind of our big ideas there. So the goal here is to explain the fears and actions the U.S. took to deal with the threats of communism inside the United States. One thing we're going to do before we hit on all that, though, is we are going to finish up on Korea. I wanted to just kind of hit back on that because the last video, we definitely ran out of time, and I probably should have made another one, but we're going to quickly relay that here because this is not going to be as long. All right, so one thing to think about, though, or two things to consider. Is it illegal to be a communist? No, it is not. All right, so even though we have a big fear of communism, you still, as an American, have the right to freedom of speech, freedom of expression. So if you are a communist, that is okay. All right, and then you also want to think back to the 1920s with the Red Scare, that fear that we had, back then, and how that was taken out on immigrant groups and people of different, working class backgrounds and things like that within the 1920s. So those are going to be something that we want to come back to here in a few minutes once we cover up the Korean War. So to kind of go a little more in depth with this, so reason again why it was divided. Okay, at the end of World War II. So Korea is this colony that Japan has had for about 45 or so years, and so it has a slight border here with the Soviet Union, borders China mainly. So when the Soviet Union begins or declares war right at the end of World War II on Japan, they start rushing troops into the Korean Peninsula. We see this as a threat that the Soviets are going to try to expand communism like they are in Eastern Europe, so we rush troops into the south and divide the country, or divide the area at the what's called the 38th parallel, this line of longitude, that essentially latitude, and says this is kind of where we're going to divide it, and then, hopefully they can reconcile one day and be one nation. So you got a communist Northern Korea and a democratic South Korea, all right? So in 1950, North Korea invades South Korea in hopes to essentially unify it. And they overrun much of the country. The U.S. rushes troops in there. But, they're backed up by Soviet money, Soviet technology, and it's not until, late in the summer that we are actually able to stabilize the situation. There's this really great military landing at the coast of Incheon, one of the more aggressive movements made by the U.S. military because of how hit or miss this tactic would have been, but it caught the North Koreans completely by surprise. And, within, again, a few weeks after that, this is like in the fall of 1950, we cross into North Korea, all right? And remember, China now is communist, and so they say, hey, you guys can, retake South Korea, that's fine, but if you enter North Korea, we're going to get involved, which is kind of where we see the UN forces here in the green, getting pretty much to the border of China, and then the Chinese intervene. They launch this major counterattack at the end of 1950, and then for the next essentially 2.5 years of war, it's back and forth fighting, kind of exactly where the border is today and where it was before at the 30th parallel, where we have this demilitarized zone. All right, so communist China got involved, and that's where we end up with a stalemate. We didn't use nuclear weapons. There was always the thought that if we ever came to it, we didn't want to. So with President Truman, he does not want to escalate this into a world war. He wants to use this policy of containment, contain communism where it is. And they got a little bit antsy in terms of, okay, well, maybe we can liberate Korea. So that did not happen. And so this is kind of our situation to this day, where North and South Korea didn't even sign a, end of war. It's just an armistice. There's no actual end of declarations. That's one of the reasons why we have this big intensity between the two peoples. So still divided to this day. Nice little video here from the History Channel about big things to know about the Korean War. All right. So the leader of the Korean family is Kim Il-sung, who was the first leader. Then his son Kim Jong-il, okay, who passed away about 9 years ago, and then it went to his son Kim Jong-un. So essentially, it says communist, but essentially it's just a dictatorship with a communist name. They're not actually a communist country. All right. They're very on their own, and have been trying to develop nuclear weapons for the last 20-odd years. So at the demilitarized zone, some kind of things here. Essentially, you got troops on both sides, ready and willing to go at any point. These two South Korean soldiers here, as they try to open up for meeting rooms in between at the border, They're holding onto each other and the wall because in the past, when they would open up the door to go have meetings, I'm putting meetings in quotation marks, North Korean troops would in fact pull South Koreans into the north, and then you could not get them back, or it would take a lot of deliberation. So, and then we have this guy here in the bottom left-hand corner. That's General James MacArthur. Okay, remember him from World War II. We didn't really mention him too much then either. He was the guy that led the defense forces in the Pacific. All right, he was the one who engineered the invasion or the amphibious landing at Incheon. But he also wanted to use nuclear war and go to much more bigger war in China and actually use nuclear weapons against China. And that was completely against American policy, and so he got relieved afterward. So we kind of used him in there because he was this big general and was trying to push the war to further ends. So when we talk about containment as a policy, okay, we have the Truman Doctrine, okay, about the idea that we need to hold it where it is and use any means at our disposal. So the economic stuff, military, all that. And so think about Berlin Airlift. Think about the Marshall Plan. Think about communism, or not communism, the Korean War, and how these all relate to containment and the Truman Doctrine. All right. So feel free to click on the videos throughout the here because they're going to have more information here. All right. So at the same time that we're dealing with communism abroad, we also have to deal with the fear here inside the United States that it's going to grow and that the government could be overthrown. So think about a second Red Scare. So the basis of the fear is that there actually had been people that had defected to the Soviet Union. All right. So a Soviet diplomat, so someone in the Soviet Union, is in Canada, goes to the Canadian government from the Soviet embassy. It gives them documents on the Soviet attempts to infiltrate the U.S. government and steal information on the atomic bomb, which they had actually done in order to get them there, or to get that nuclear bomb from 1949. So there is a legitimate fear that the Soviets are in the country trying to steal it, and that's if we had actually been able to watch the movie that was initially scheduled for us called Bridge of Spies, and if you have access to it, great. It's a great Tom Hanks film about kind of this fear of communism inside the country. Take a look at it because it kind of definitely plays on in these fears. So spying later reveals or what we call Project Verona, which is a government project that was revealed about a decade ago, that the idea that two groups of people, the Rosenbergs, these two people over here, and Alger Hiss, were Soviet spies sent to get American secrets, get stuff on the atomic and hydrogen bombs, and bring that back to the Soviet Union. So the Rosenbergs were actually executed. Alger Hiss was fired from the government and put under arrest. So some of the responses to the fear inside the U.S. have to do with the fact that we have these people who are essentially spying for the Soviet Union, for communist countries, and we also have witch hunts going on, i.e. with this guy over here. So the government, churches, businesses, unions begin to expel known and suspected communists. So this is where that Hollywood 10 article, the Blacklist article on Schoology in this section is. I want you to take a look at that to go further in depth. So essentially, anybody who is known to be a communist, even though it's not illegal to be a communist, or to even espouse communist views, essentially are fired from their jobs. They are put through loyalty tests, or even suspected ones put through loyalty tests. And if you're fired and you're suspected of being a communist or are a communist, you may not be able to find a job. So good luck surviving in the United States, where you still have freedom of speech and expression, but there's legitimate fear of this overrunning America. All right, so definitely want to look at that article about the Blacklist and the Hollywood 10. All right, so HUAC, which is the House of Un-American Activities Committee, all right, led by this guy, Senator Joseph McCarthy, goes on what we call witch hunts. All right, so they investigate considerable what they call anti-American activities and sympathizers of these people and their activities. So essentially anybody who they believe to be in league with communists or anti-American values. And again, how do you measure out what that means? Essentially, it's all their enemies that they go after, even if they're not communist. So Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin takes hold of this, goes to the Senate floor one day and says, I have a list of this many people in the government who are known communists. And he begins, and he uses HUAC, which was not his committee, but he took it over and essentially turned it into a dog and pony show where he's showing off, all of his skills and what he can accomplish. And this is what raises his popularity and his standing inside the United States government by saying and pointing out, well, these people are supposed communists, without actually naming any names. And once he does, they start to investigate these people, and no evidence has ever turned up that anyone that McCarthy accused was a communist or a communist sympathizer. All right, and he doesn't attack just, Joe Schmo on the street. He attacks people inside the government. And this all started with, the idea of loyalty programs that President Truman put forth. All right? Just as an idea. And there were a few definitely within there who were, had tendencies and might have actually, done some things there, but it wasn't a whole lot. So he was very vague in who he attacked. He used a lot of intimidation, accusing a lot of people, and essentially anybody that stood up to him was not necessarily backed up by other people in the government out of fear of how popular he was. It wasn't until the advent of television that people saw kind of what he was doing and how bad it was going to be. Because he went after people inside the government, very well-known, very well-beloved figures, such as people in President Eisenhower's administration. Eisenhower takes over after Truman, the World War II general, McCarthy ends up losing popularity. He doesn't get reelected, and then he dies a few years later. All right, he was a pretty young guy. He was only in his 40s at that point, I think. So, remember, there's that article. Take a look at it on the blacklist and that. So, how do we teach people about the Cold War? All right, so there's this really interesting video. This was an actual video about how do you spot a communist. Take a look at that. And then this really good one on what do you teach kids about how to prepare for a nuclear bomb attack. All right, so my father actually had to watch these videos and had to prepare in case there's a nuclear bomb attack. Watch the video and, just kind of think about what's the purpose of actually teaching kids this stuff. Because at the end of the day, there's nothing that can actually save you if you're in the vicinity of a nuclear bomb attack. You might get lucky in terms of your location and your spot, but this is what they would tell kids about how to save themselves, and you want to consider why they would do that. Okay, so a lot of families started to invest in bomb shelters and actually started to build them, having canned foods and preserves in case a nuclear bomb actually went off, due to the fear that this was actually going to escalate and get worse. So, different varieties here, beds, nice little kitchen linens here. But again, all this food's stored up for a very long time. Okay, so some things that they might have in there, emergency oxygen, food and water, batteries, a Geiger counter to tell you how much radioactivity is around, periscope to see above ground after your home has been destroyed, lead-clad steel, and an air filter to ensure that you're getting air into the ground, air exhaust pump, plumbing, so you can go to the bathroom, stuff like that. Okay, all this stuff is supposed to be planned out in there. All right, so this was stuff that people did to try and help cope with the fear of nuclear war. All right, so this is where we're talking about trying to contain it within the United States, containing communism. All right, and this is stuff that, is pretty big throughout the 1940s or late 40s and throughout much of the 50s. Then it kind of dies off a little bit, but there's always that fear of nuclear war, which is something we're going to talk about in the next video or two. So take a look, and yeah, there we go.